So good morning, and we are going to. So we have looked at a number of what I might call civilizations, even though we have agreed that that's probably not a great um, concept to use, because we agree that all peoples are civilized, perhaps differently. So we looked at African kingdoms, we looked at the formation of North America, changes in republics in places like France. We examined what was going on in China and Japan. Um, the changes that they effected or failed to effect. The contact with the West, substantive contact, so things like trade and having ambassadors and so on. And then we examined Russia and the Ottoman Empire, so two of the places that did not really modernize very quickly. So soon we are going to look at other places and some of the, I don't know if I'll call them challenges or. So, for example, look at Australia, New Zealand, their settlement, and so on. But we'll talk about those when we talk about imperialism and colonization after spring break. So, today I want us to think about some of the key drivers of the empires so for example, European empires, some of the key drivers, inventions, and other things that help them to advance, and the machinery or industries that produced these changes. So we're looking at industrialization and its impacts. Its impacts are not always positive. So there were some negative impacts, and we're going to see this. So, for example, kids working about 12 to 18 hours, working in mines underground, and so on. And so, some of the places that we're going to talk about in the context of industrialization are the US, Britain, some European countries, and see how they adapted newer technologies and the industrialization models, and those that did not, but also see some of the outcomes of that. So, for example, when you make production of certain goods more efficient, you probably need a market. Now, European countries were creating markets, but they were also invading other countries. So we'll talk about industrialization and some of the changes that we see. Now, today you probably don't see this kind of machinery because the US is not really producing a lot of textiles and those kinds of things. We shall talk about textiles, which were the first space where industrialization happened, and see why that was the case. So these are industrialization brought us many things, including electricity and newer clothes and cars and those kinds of things. But there were hidden sides to industrialization, and I think this picture captures this very well. So this girl is probably about 10 years old, and she's working in the factory. We'll talk about how also kids sometimes had to go into those machines when they broke down, and sometimes they would restart. So there was a lot of injuries that were probably not. So what we'll be talking about is the origins of industrialization, the social and economic impact of industrialization, perhaps even political outcomes, and some of the intellectual and cultural responses. So, for example, we shall preface Karl Marx wrote his Communist Manifesto in 1848, together with, what's his name? And so the reactions to these factory conditions were different. in different places, but we actually see a lot of workers beginning to organize and sort of push back against industrialization. And so we shall think about where industrialization began, the effects, the social patterns, and how they changed. So, for example, industrialization included factories that were located together. And so you begin to see the growth of cities. Now, what did the growth of cities entail? What kinds of systems came about? So think about schools, prisons. So there were many outcomes of industrialization and new directions and the responses. And so when we think about industrialization, it has two phases. The first phase was primarily driven by steam. So steam engines, steam everything. The second phase was driven by newer technologies. So, for example, electricity, the telegraph, so those kinds of things. We also see, for example, even though the text suggests that this is the beginning of globalization, I don't know if I agree with that. I think globalization began about 1500s when all parts of Earth were connected. But we shall talk about this and sort of see what kinds of transitions we see, what kind of machinery we see, what kind of patterns we see out of this. And so one of the things that industrialization does is to transition from manual labor to natural power sources. I don't know, does anyone know why we use horsepower when we talk about engines in cars? Horsepower. Like you'd probably think that we use a different measure. But so, for example, when the first engines were developed, and their inventors were trying to sell them to like farmers and so on. So, for example, if you're pumping water, you have horses going around and around to pump the water. But so if I bring you the engine, the newly created mechanical thing, you want to know how many horses it's going to replace. And so there's a very interesting calculation by, I think, James Watt, and you probably have heard of Watts. And so we begin to see how the past actually affects the present. So we talk about horsepower. So we're also going to see some of the machine-driven production, the vast outcome in goods production, new technologies, new procedures, businesses. So it's not just factories. We begin to see the development of new businesses that catered to the people who are working in the factories. Now, so industrialization begins in Britain, and the question we might ask is why? Why Britain? Why not other places? Why the 18th century, and why in textiles, and how the changes become self-sustaining? So to think about industrialization, we have to start with human needs. Now, I'm sure you probably have heard of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so when we think about a lot of people before the 19th century were really engaged in meeting the basic needs. So food, shelter, clothing. A lot of people produced what they used, or at least it was produced within the village. So people didn't really need stuff that came from outside until we see the invention of these machines that sort of change. It's bringing new goods, and people now begin to want these new goods. But so it's useful for example, even you to think about your needs. Now, sometimes we don't think about some of this like food. We assume we are going to have food. And we probably do. We assume we are going to have warmth. And, I don't know if you have lit a fire in the recent past. I know Winston probably has not. But So think about the factors that drove industrialization. And actually, if you think about staying warm, and then you take your mind back to 1400s to 1800s, and think about Europe and North America, places that have winters. Think about how people stayed warm, and really mostly they used firewood. But if you have population growth and they're using these resources and trees are not growing very fast, you probably use clothes and other things to stay warm. Um, but so when we think about the industrialization, I thought that maybe this is useful. So I don't know how many of us would survive without Wi-Fi, even though Wi-Fi here sometimes is very sketchy. But so in thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, this is the least: physiological, safety, love, esteem, and self-actualization when you are at the top of your achievement. So there were three conditions that led to industrialization beginning in Britain. And so one of them is coal and colonists, or at least coal and colonist theory. A thriving merchant class that actually was also represented in the British Parliament, and so they were passing laws that favored things like innovation, investment in businesses, and so on. And then there was the successful banking system. So one of the oldest central banks in the world was the Bank of England. Which was created in 1694. I don't know. Do you know what the official bank of the United States is? Yeah.
Federal Reserve.
The Federal Reserve. I was hoping someone would say Bank of America, Bank of England, but it's the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve came into existence probably after 1913. So it hasn't been around that long. And so if you think about now, of course, there was attempts to create a Bank of the United States in, I think, 1812. And the Supreme Court said something about the impossibility of doing that. But eventually we see the Federal Reserve. So think about the monetary policies that the Federal Reserve does. So like raising interests, regulating the supply of money, and so on. So England had this by 1684. Now this map shows some of the places where industrialization will begin. And I don't know how many of you are from states that are next to the ocean. Now, if you're from Virginia, so for example, this is close to the ocean. North Carolina, the eastern part would be, so for example, Kill Devil Hills and the Outer Banks, and yeah, so those places. But even if you're not from those kinds of states, I don't know if you know if there are basements, for example, in Hampton Roads. Do you think there are basements? Do you think houses have basements? Have you been to a house and wondered if it had a basement around here or on the coast? It probably, if you have been, and you probably didn't wonder about that, but houses built near the ocean do not have basements. The reason is the water table. So this groundwater. So if you've seen a well, so if you're near the coast, the groundwater is very high. So if you build a basement, it's probably going to flood because you reach the water level very quickly. And so Britain as an island, so coal, and I'm sure you've heard of coal, it powers most everything, probably even the electricity that we're using today here now. But so if you sort of think about coal, Britain had lots of it, a lot of coal. They wanted to dig it up, but when you dig, you actually reach the water table, and so mines were flooding. So how do you keep mines from flooding? They had these systems where, you, for example, you lower a bucket, take out the water, bring it back up. And so that was very tedious. If you've ever seen a well, or maybe if you look on YouTube and see how to draw water from a well, you'll see those buckets and so on. And so if you're actually digging coal, that is a very tedious process. And so problems often lead to innovation. And so the first engines were built to empty mines. But so when we create something, we often see it spawn other things. So, for example, if you think of the technological revolution, something like the internet has spawned many things, including social media. And so, even with the coal, we see the engines. Okay, they're being used to empty wells, but they're also going to be used for other things. So when further discussing this coal and colonies, so Great Britain was an island that was sitting on coal. Now, the reason that the British wanted to dig up the coal was that Europe was going through a mini ice age from about 1400 to 1800, and so winters were especially cold. How do you keep warm? You burn firewood, but firewood is probably sometimes not enough, and so coal was seen as an alternative heating source. And so, you dig it up and you use it to heat houses and other things. Now, Britain has been a colonial power for a while. So if you think about the 13 colonies, they were associated or maybe belonged to Britain. And so even when they became independent, it's not like Britain stopped the practice of colonizing people. So they lost the U.S., North America. We are going to see them begin to colonize places like India, Australia, and so on. And so these colonies actually provided new products. For example, India provided a lot of the clothes from cotton. Now, India had a very robust cottage industry where people actually worked from their houses. And so by this trade, the British realized, cotton garments are better than wool garments, because if you're trying to stay warm, if it's winter, it's not easy to dry wool, but it's probably easier to dry cotton. And so cotton was very easily manufactured, even though it took quite a while. So, for example, people who are spinning yarn is what you use to create clothes. So, and we'll probably see this later on, but so it took about 5 to 7 years to weave 100 pounds of yarn. So imagine you're trying to weave yarn and you're going to spend 5 to 7 years of your life just doing this one thing. Now, when machines come up and they begin weaving the yarn, they are doing that 100 pounds in about 2 weeks. So this is a lot more efficient. It's more efficient, but what does it do to the cottage industry? It kind of destroys it. But also we see some of the reasons for some of these developments as, so what we call the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange, which is given its name from Columbus, is the availability of new foods, new plants, new things that improved life expectancy. And so the population was growing, and so how do you feed? Now, staying with Britain, we also see a thriving merchant class. And so Britain, we talked about revolutions, but we really didn't go into it. But one of the things that the British determined was that the king could not impose taxes without parliamentary approval. This is something that the US has adopted. If you were paying attention to the news last week, you'd have seen that the Congress was working on funding the government and they sort of kick the can down the road for another week. So maybe the government will be funded for another week. And so with Britain, the king could impose any taxes they wanted. And so Parliament puts a stop to this. But also the Parliament, the people who are in Parliament, the House of Commons, that's what they call the lower house, was full of merchants, bankers, lawyers, and businessmen and inventors. And so it was easy to create the conditions for investment, to provide loans for risky adventures. There's I think, a parody, maybe movie around the world in 80 days, and it kind of highlights this. Well, we also talked about the banks, and so Bank of England, 1694, giving loans to businessmen, entrepreneurs, funding new developments, including crops. And so we actually see the role of the bank being very important. Now, we did talk about or briefly talk about colonies. And so, for example, India was a great source of cotton. They create new products that the British want, even if it's just clothes. Now, I don't know if any of you know how silk was made. Anyone? I don't know if they still do this. Now, there's artificial silk, which I think is called rayon, but there's also the original silk. This will probably gross some people out, but silk was made by boiling silkworms. When they died, you had a bunch of silk, but that is absolutely very inefficient. Like, you have to find the silkworms, and how much silk are you going to make? But so there are these new types of, I'm going to call them threads, silk and cotton, but cotton was especially important. And if you actually look at some of your clothes, they are probably made out of cotton. Easier to dry in those kinds of conditions. But initially, we also see, weavers who are working in domestic cottage industries. Now, some of what the British did to its new colonies was like what they did to the 13 colonies. So imposing taxes, and so it made so the British passed laws that will speed up manufacturing of cotton, but they also enact protectionist laws so that only they can obtain this cotton and so on. Now, in terms of definitions, cottage industry is a small scale businesses that are usually, so I think today we might call them mom and pop kinds of businesses. But these were actually created in the home by family members. Now, in terms of industrialization and what drives it, and this has actually happened, maybe not in your lifetime, but in the past maybe 40 years. So think about, but also think about the minimum wage. So a lot of states have enacted higher minimum wage. So, for example, California, I think it's like $22 per hour. Now, sort of think about what happens when wages go up. So the cost of production goes up. And if you're a factory owner, that means your profits, unless you increase the cost of your products, you are going to be going at a loss. And so workers were demanding high wages, and so it was an impetus for using machines. Machines don't work. I mean, they don't get tired. They do break down. And I think even now we're having these conversations about, for example, what does it mean for robots when they are replacing people? The robots don't have like needs. I guess you just power them up and they work continuously, but human beings have needs. And so when robots are replacing humans, it's probably better for the companies that are producing, but it's bad for humans because now you have people who don't have jobs. So the workers' wages increase was important in driving industrialization to find machines that could do what humans were doing. We talked about coal, but also these are the days of enlightenment, of new thought. So if you think about before about 1600s, if you were trying to invent these new things, you probably didn't have much success. And of course, there was a question of what the church would think about those. But for Britain, it was a center of intellectual discussion. So you see individuals like Bacon, Boyle, Newton, and so on. These were driving but actually, particularly if you think about, and I don't know if you're members of learned societies. So, for example, there's that society of geniuses called Mensa. Now, but also you have, for example, honor societies. So think about honor societies, but on a national scale. And so Britain had, for example, the Royal Society of London, which starts in 1640. And you can sort of see the people who were members. So Wren, Wilkins, Moray, Boyle. And so the idea here was that people could meet, people who are doing theoretical research, but people who are also doing practical research. And so theory, math, and those kinds of things. And it was an open intellectual forum, which actually did help very much in founding the Royal Society. But where did the Industrial Revolution begin, and with what kinds of machines? We talked about it beginning in the cotton industry, and some of these were just very simple developments. So, for example, the flying shuttle, I think the flying shuttle is in the middle, was meant to make weaving less tiresome. There was a spinning jenny that was created by Hargreaves, the water frame by Arkwright, and the spinning mule. I probably have some images of some of these. So these are critical to the Industrial Revolution, which is defined as technological breakthroughs that gave humankind a new degree of control over nature, created vast new wealth, transformed the daily economic activities of most people, and opened unimagined possibilities for social and cultural life. So eventually we are going to see the Industrial Revolution creating things like movies, cameras, and initially there were still films. So until maybe the Industrial Revolution, most people didn't have control over nature. We can't necessarily say that even now people have control over nature. If you've seen tornadoes and hurricanes and those kinds of things. So industrialization was about efficiencies, new efficiency, but also new wealth. So machines produce more goods, which produced the need for markets. They also simplified labor, and as we were mentioning, in 1800 it took 50,000 human hours, so 5.7 years or probably more, to make 100 pounds of cotton yarn, but the machine actually took 135 hours. A week has 168 hours. So the machine is actually doing what the human does in 7 to 10 years in 1 week. I think everyone would agree that that is probably a good thing. Now, these are some of the technologies that were invented, and I'm not sure that you can see this outside a museum. But again, you can sort of see the machines and imagine how they might be weaving yarn. So, for example, that white stuff is yarn. Now, I hope this will work. These are machines but again, this is the spinning wheel, but this is so machines are the spinning mule. I do not want you to concern yourself with what the spinning mule is. This is the power loom. Again, some of these things require driven today because we have the other machines that are doing some of the work for us. And so again, this is the power load that is created by hardware. And so again, you can see sort of how it's making thread, fabric, and so on. So this you probably won't see, and so I wouldn't worry about them. So when you have these machines, you need to house them in big buildings. Now, initially, and even today, you probably see that many factories are located near running water. This is important for two reasons. So the initial machines were steam driven. So if you have a steam engine, you need a supply of water. So it makes sense to build your factory near water, but also transportation of goods. About 80% of all the goods that are sold in the world actually are transported through the sea, the ocean. And you actually live close to one of those big ports, so the Port of Virginia. And so a lot of factories were near water, near running water, to generate steam and transportation and so on. And so you actually begin to see the concentration of factories near the same places because every factory is trying to go near the water. And so this will begin the process of creating cities. So as I mentioned, when you have these machines, there's people who want to, or you need people to run them. And so this is the cheap labor. Factories attract labor, and some of the goods they are producing are making life better. And so by 1830, we see about 1 million textile factory workers. And so again, they need new, like if you go to the factory and you have a baby who is 2 years old, what do you do with them? Now, of course, during that period, you probably leave them to the 5-year-old. But eventually we are going to begin to see the formation of other systems. So we do see the globalization of commerce. So machines and textile production, while it was concentrated in the UK, we actually began to see some of those machines coming to the US, and we'll talk about some of those individuals. Now, Europe becomes the center of manufacturing, while previously it was India and China. So actually by about 1800, India and China accounted for 53% of global production. By about 1850, they only account for 2%. Because machines have come in and they've made. Now, of course, the new machines are existing alongside slavery. So cotton in the south is grown and moved to the north, made into yarn, sold. But so again, we used to see high production that brings down prices, and people are more able to buy these newer things. Now, so the Industrial Revolution sort of begins with, as we mentioned, the steam engine. And so James Watt kind of built the first machine, and that's a rendition of what it looked like. But Newcomen's atmospheric engine is probably more useful, and you can see all the elements we are talking about. So you can see down there is this fire that is probably fed by coal, that is heating water, that is producing steam. And steam is making the right side pane move up. Now, on the left, what is happening is that if this is a mine, you are having it scoop out water and dump it out. So this becomes very efficient. The problem is this is a fixed engine. And so how do you actually use this kind of engine to power locomotives, to power ships? So you have to miniaturize it. And so this is what we begin to see continuing to happen. Now, in terms of the major milestones of the Industrial Revolution, we can look at, for example, James Watt, the steam engine, the railroad opening. And so again, the initially railroads were used to transport goods, But of course, somebody had the clever idea of why don't we put some people in those carts that are running on these rails. And so we actually see this timeline gives you an interconnected sort of timeline, because it's also talking about, for example, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who was his friend, and whose father owned a factory in England, right? The Communist Manifesto, Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, but also other things like the opening of the Suez Canal, paintings, and so on. So it's useful to think about what did the industrialization entail, what kinds of processes were involved, what kind of goods were produced, and what kind of reactions there were. And this is what sort of the the milestones does. Now, one of the things that we probably will talk about later on is tariffs. You'll probably run into this. And so tariffs are costs that are imposed to people who are trying to bring stuff into your country. So, for example, France is well known for cheese and wine. Now, if I wanted to sell my wine in France or my cheese, I'll probably pay a tariff. And sometimes the tariffs are so high that it makes no sense to sell wine and cheese to the French. And so during industrialization, we see this process happening a lot. And so most of the tariffs are intended to give domestic manufacturers an edge. So some of the industries that are protected. Now, so the Industrial Revolution is going on from about 1700s. It's accelerating in the 1800s, but most of the Industrial Revolution outcomes were seen in Britain. Europe didn't adapt very quickly. It actually took a while. Germany took probably the longest, but when they start doing changes to their manufacturing systems and so on, they actually make very quick changes. But so overall, we see industrialization, urbanization, infrastructure, roads, canals, and railways. We see people moving to these cities. But we also see the expansion of, for example, the railroad carrying passengers. We also see elements of new sources of entertainment. Now, these maps give you an idea of the industrialization that was happening across both Britain and Europe. So these are some of the major centers of production. So you can see railways, coal fields, shipbuilding, chemical manufacturing, lead mining, iron extraction, tin mining, copper mining, and textiles. And so actually in England, you see that textiles were there were lots of textile manufacturing sort of in the Midlands, like Manchester, Liverpool, and so on. So industrialization does spread to the US. And so Samuel Slater is one of the individuals who kind of bring those machines. And I think he builds the first water-powered textile factory in Rhode Island. And we are going to see the growth of manufacturing. We are going to see the adoption of newer technologies as they become available. It's probably terrible to say that wars are good for technological development. So if you think about, for example, the Second World War, that's when the atomic bomb was created. And so the US Civil War did interrupt America's industrialization, but it also produced newer technologies. So for example, the ironclads, the ships. We also see the development of the railroad. So, for example, the U.S. adopts the railway, and in 1869, the Trans-Pacific Railroad actually connects the East and the West. If you look at a map of the U.S. in the 1830s, 40s, you have settlements like in California and the East Coast, but in the middle, it's sort of like, well, Native Americans. So we see the US actually adopt this technology so fast that it becomes the biggest economy by 1914, overtaking the British. But again, you can see the development of the railway, 2,800 miles in 1840. By 1870, 30 years later, there are 53,000 miles of railroad in the US. So now, of course, you have probably seen all of these reports in the news about trains derailing East Palestine and other places. But yeah, so 1869 transcontinental railroad connects the East and the West, and so the USA is now kind of really connected. So the first industrial revolution uses steam power, steam engines put on carts and trains and other things. We see the factories and so on. But so, for example, necessity is, I think they say, the mother of invention. So iron rusts very quickly. And so if, for example, you build a ship that goes into the water and it's made of iron, eventually it's going to corrode and probably, break down. And so so does wood. But so we see the finding or the pursuit of newer, what am I going to call it? So newer technological advances, newer products that avoid this. And so the second phase of the Industrial Revolution uses other materials like steel, electricity, and chemicals, even though electricity will not be created until about the 1860s, 1870s. Michael Faraday in New York and other industrialists. And so, but it's important to keep in mind the first phase, steam engines, steam everything. The second phase uses chemicals, electricity, and other things. Now, so this graphic I thought was interesting to demonstrate the how the steam engine worked on ships. And so, of course, nobody probably will create this. But so the steam engine was driving the paddle wheel that would be driving ships. We talked about part of the steam engines and the steamships when we talked about the Opium Wars. But so we by 1850 we are going to see engines in use. They are in use in factories and mines, but then we see them placed on vehicles. And again, you have to think about the vehicles that were there then. It's ox carts. And so if you actually sort of think about the width of a car, you'll probably see, usually there were 2 horses, and you'll probably see it's about 2 horses. But so we actually see industrialization kind of developing and going to other places. The Japanese were fascinated when Matthew Perry gave them a replica of a steam locomotive and rail. Now, and so they will adapt these technologies quickly, and by about you probably know that Japan has this very high speed rail, and so you can sort of see this developing from 1853. China, on the other hand, kind of thought that the rail was not a very good thing, and so they destroyed the first rail that was ever built. So it's sort of like you see some early adapters of new technologies and others that probably don't. Now, if you ever watched older movies, you'll probably see steam locomotives. Wild West, Will Smith. I think you see those. And so steam powered railway, which powered goods, transportation, and so on. And so people are still going to try and miniaturize these engines, and that is what is going to bring us cars and eventually planes. Now, but also we see the sort of representation of what the steam engines were doing. So now I don't think this image presents a very healthy way to ride a train because you're behind the smoke and it's open. Um, yeah, but eventually you're going to see covered um, carriages that will replace the then most reliable transportation means, which, for example, was a stagecoach. So we are going to see these things continue to develop, and this kind of shows you sort of the working of the steam engine in trains. Um, so the individual who first puts the engine on tracks is George Stephenson, again British. But initially, the steam engine was used, or the steam-powered train was used to transport goods. But rail develops very quickly, and it produces this boom in rail shipping and so on, which we kind of talked about. Now, this is again a very environmentally probably unhealthy um, representation of how a steam engine would work on a ship. The funnels, the paddle steamer. But so these are the early initial uses of the yeah. So this is probably a better view of the steamship. And so again, you will see today you don't see any sails. Actually, you do, like on yachts and those kinds of things. Um, but so the steam engine is used together with the traditional ways of sailing, which used the wind. Now, so we begin to see the development of entertainment or recreation as an element of the Industrial Revolution. So, for example, Robert Fulton uh, begins a steamboat business in New York, the River Hudson, New York City to Albany. Um, and so you're actually beginning to see, and I don't know if any of you have ever taken a cruise, well, maybe not a cruise, but even here in Hampton, there's like a well, there are leisure or pleasure ships that you can get on, have your dinner, sail around the area, and then come back. But also, we think about, for example, um, the long distance travel, cruises, and so on. But so one of the other things that the steamship does is to make transportation more efficient. So in 1816, it took about 30 days, 34 days to sail from Britain to the US. So if something happened in Britain, there was no way of telling Americans until after a month. And so the steam engine, the steamship cuts down this travel time to about 17 days. Now it's probably even faster. But also now we have planes, so you probably don't need to sail. Um, Now, the paddle steamers had obvious problems. And this included, for example, if you're in a war, all you need to do is to break the paddle steamer. And so people are beginning to think about how do you make sure that your ship can still work. And so people are beginning to invent the screw. We'll probably see some of these. But so one of the things that we are seeing is steamships now being used more broadly across Europe and the US. So the Great Lakes, Ohio, Mississippi rivers, regular transatlantic steamship. And if you're familiar with maybe the Titanic, um, belong to this kind of line. But you actually see a lot of people beginning to use steamships to come to the U.S. to immigrate to other places, but also for nefarious purposes, including, for example, the Opium Wars. Now, so the the pro- the screw type propeller for ships uh, begins to develop about 1840s, 1850s. today this is what we see. Now this is from the aircraft carrier George Washington, and you can sort of see how big the screw propeller is compared to those people. Now, of course, for example, aircraft carriers today are powered by nuclear power, and so it's probable they have the more power, and but so it kind of shows you where we come from, the steam, the side paddle steamer to what we have today. Now, we also see the invention of other things, and I don't know if you know who invented the bicycle. Anyone? Who invented the bicycle? I'm sure you probably had a bicycle at some point in your life. Did you wonder who invented it? So the bicycle was invented by, I think his name is Kirkpatrick. We shall probably see that later on. But these are the various types of bicycles, and so you can see people are creative, but eventually maybe none of these, other than the Rover number 12 that we see today. But these were really cool, like this one here. It's like you're sitting and you're riding the bicycle. So this is the first patented bicycle, and I have many questions about it. Now, of course, it doesn't have the chain, and so the question is, how did you ride this? Unless you're riding it downhill, but also if you're riding it downhill, how are you going to stop it? Yeah, looks very dangerous, and of course, it didn't have rubber tires. Rubber would be invented later, so yeah, this is a weird looking contraption. But so this is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. We are inventing other, well, I'm saying we like I was there, but humanity is inventing other things. And so, for example, you see the greatest necessity of the age, Gayety's medicated paper for the water closet. What do you think medicated paper for the water closet is? I am sure we use it today.
Or something?
Wipes. No, it's toilet paper.
Oh.
Yeah, toilet paper. So, I mean, the water closet is what people sometimes call the bathrooms. But so you see the advertisement. It's like, yeah, I'm going to buy medicated paper for the water closet. It sounds like a very nice idea. So in terms of the second phase of the Industrial Revolution, we begin to see new materials being created. So for example, steel. Steel is a combination of carbon and iron. It doesn't corrode. It is used to build strong things like buildings and skyscrapers and ships. We did mention that the war is a good thing for technology. I think that's a terrible thing to say. But so we are beginning to see the Industrial Revolution beginning to expand, and these new products being made, and so on. So some of the late adopters of technology were fortunate because they did not have to reinvent the wheel. And so, for example, Germany was one of these. They didn't really need to reinvent the wheel. And so these are some of the advantages of steel. It's lighter, it's harder, it's more durable than iron. And so it was used to create better railroads, skyscrapers. Anyone know where the first skyscraper was built and when? Not too long ago, actually. Well, I mean, it's long ago, but 1903 Chicago. It's no longer there, but and so again, you see the uses of steel. So, for example, in ships, so stronger, faster, lighter ships, and also being used in. Now, does anyone know what this building is? I'm sure you have seen it. If you've watched Tom Cruise. Mhm. This movies Tom Cruise makes, what are they called? Mission Impossible, maybe 3. The Burj Khalifa, tallest building in the world. And so this is some of the outcomes of steel, making buildings that now, of course, maybe in future we are going to invent other materials. So, for example, if you think about airplanes, and what they were made out of. So, for example, out of aluminum, but now we are seeing them made out of composite carbon. So, again, we see this development, continued development of. Now, there were other advances, some of them not great. So, chemicals. So, for example, fertilizer. Ammonia is used for many things. Nitrates are fertilizers, but ammonia can also be turned in, or fertilizers can be turned into explosives. We see, for example, the development of dynamite, and I'm sure you've heard of the Nobel Peace Prize. Alfred Nobel was the person who invented dynamite, and so when he saw what his invention was being used for, he then started thinking about peace, and so he creates the Nobel Peace Prize and other prizes so that humanity can pursue peaceful exploits. But yeah, so the dynamite was important because when you want an explosion, and if you're digging for coal, if you're building railroads, if you are sometimes if you're in war, you use it. And so, for example, the Panama Canal was one of the places where the dynamite was used very well. Now, if you probably have seen some of these names, and so they'll be familiar. So, for example, Charles Goodyear produces vulcanized rubber. So then that leads to the creation of tires. But also we see synthetic plastic. But we also see new medicines that improve people's lives. So, for example, quinine, which I'm not sure if you know what it does, because this hemisphere doesn't really have malaria. But malaria, you can cure it with quinine. And so, for example, most Europeans, when they went to like Africa, they would die of malaria. And so quinine was an important thing. Aspirin was also important. But we also see communications revolution. So, for example, Maxwell, Heinrich Rudolf Hertz, Marconi, who creates the first sort of radio, even though it was called the Marconi Wireless. The first transatlantic radio message was broadcast in 1903. So again, you see, these are not very in 2024. So 121 years ago. And so today we don't even, your generation probably doesn't see actual radios. You have like an app on your phone and you can listen to. But if you have seen a radio, an actual radio, this is the predecessor to the to the radio. But also, if you're tuning your, or at least in earlier years, if you're tuning your radio, you would tune it to certain kilohertz or megahertz and so on. Now, so that is some of the communications revolution. Now, other things include, for example, Michael Faraday's electromagnetic generator. So this was used to produce electricity, but this is direct current. You probably have done these experiments where you have two magnets and a coil of wire, and that produces current. But Nikola Tesla actually creates what is called the electric induction engine that uses alternating current. So what we use today is alternating current, not direct current, even though we use that in batteries and so on. Samuel Morse creates the Morse code. And in 1876, Alexander Graham Bell creates the telephone. Now, what do you think were the first words ever spoken on the telephone? Is it hello? Yeah, maybe. So actually, the first words were, Mr. Watson, please come here. So the telephone, when it was invented, only went to the next room. So it's not like they created a telephone that. And so to make sure that it was working, Bell says, Mr. Watson, come here. Mr. Watson was in the other room with phone receiver. And so you can see where we have come from. Think about this and then think about your smartphone. Um, and you can see sort of the revolution of the telephone. Old movies will have what is on the left, and then it develops into what's in the middle. I don't know if any of you are familiar with telephone booths. Yeah, okay, so it's probably telling us that it is time to go. So on